The brain feels like the seat of awareness, the place where experience happens, the organ that makes sense of the world. It seems straightforward enough. Signals arrive from the eyes, ears, skin, and tongue. The brain processes them. Reality appears. Yet when neuroscience examines what actually occurs inside the skull, something stranger emerges. The brain does not simply receive the world. It constructs it, not occasionally, not as a backup mechanism, but constantly, as its primary function. What feels like direct perception is actually an ongoing prediction, refined by incoming data, but never fully determined by it. The world experienced is not the world that exists. It is the brain's best guess, updated moment by moment, mostly accurate, occasionally wildly wrong, and always, quietly, invented. Welcome to Sleep Knowledge. If you find comfort in exploring how the mind builds what it mistakes for reality, settle in and let these ideas about the brain unfold slowly. And if you feel moved to, share where you are drifting off tonight. It is always warming to know how far these quiet thoughts travel. Neuroscience has spent more than a century mapping the brain's structure, tracing its connections, and observing its activity during various tasks. Research institutions like the Allen Institute for Brain Science, the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research, and laboratories at MIT, Stanford, and University College London have contributed detailed maps of neural circuits, recordings of individual neurons, and imaging studies that show which regions activate during perception, memory, decision-making, and rest. What this work reveals is not a simple relay system where sensory input travels to a processing center and then produces an output. Instead, the brain operates more like a prediction engine, constantly generating models of what it expects to encounter and then checking those models against incoming data. When predictions match reality closely enough, experience feels seamless. When they do not, adjustments occur, sometimes consciously, often not. This is not speculation. It is what experiments consistently demonstrate. The brain's activity patterns suggest it spends more energy on internal processing than on handling sensory input. Visual cortex, for instance, receives far more connections from other brain regions than it does from the eyes. Auditory cortex is similarly dominated by internal feedback rather than signals from the ears. This architecture makes sense only if the brain is doing something other than passively receiving information. It is actively generating interpretations, and sensory data serves primarily to refine those interpretations rather than to create them from scratch. Settle in. Let the brain's quiet strangeness unfold gently. Before diving into how perception works, it helps to consider what the brain is working with. Sensory organs do not deliver a clear picture of reality. They deliver electrical impulses, patterns of activation across neurons, signals that carry no inherent meaning. The retina does not send images to the brain. It sends rates of firing from photoreceptor cells, organized into rough spatial patterns but lacking color, depth, or object identity. The cochlea does not send sounds. It sends frequency information, timing data, intensity levels. The skin does not send the feeling of texture. It sends pressure changes, temperature shifts, vibration patterns. All of this raw data arrives at the brain as neural activity, indistinguishable in format from the activity generated by the brain's own internal processes. There is nothing in the signal itself that says, "This is the outside world," versus "This is memory," or "This is imagination." The brain has to infer the source, the meaning, and the appropriate response. It does this by building models, internal simulations of what might be happening based on past experience, current context, and expectations about how the world typically behaves. When a pattern of retinal activation arrives, the brain does not start from scratch trying to figure out what it means. It already has a running hypothesis about what should be visible right now. based on where attention was directed a moment ago, what was seen recently, what typically appears in this environment, and what actions are currently being planned. The incoming data either confirms that hypothesis, leading to a smooth continuation of experience, or conflicts with it, triggering an update. Most of the time, the hypothesis is close enough that only minor adjustments are needed. Occasionally, the mismatch is large, and perception shifts noticeably. This process happens so quickly and so automatically that it never feels like guessing. But neuroscience research, particularly work done at institutions like the Salk Institute for Biological Studies and the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging, has shown that perception is better understood as controlled hallucination. The brain hallucinates the world constantly, and sensory input keeps that hallucination tethered to reality. When sensory input is reduced or ambiguous, the hallucination drifts. Patterns emerge that are not there. Faces appear in clouds, voices are heard in white noise. Movement is detected at the edge of vision, where nothing moved. These are not malfunctions. They are the prediction system doing what it always does, generating interpretations in the absence of clear data. The strangeness is not that this happens occasionally. The strangeness is that this is how perception always works. The only difference is that most of the time, predictions align well with reality, so the constructed nature of experience remains invisible. Consider color, which feels like an obvious property of objects. Apples are red, grass is green, the sky is blue. Neuroscience shows that color does not exist in the world. It exists in the brain. Light has wavelengths. Surfaces reflect certain wavelengths and absorb others, but wavelength is not color. Color is a perceptual category created by the brain to efficiently represent differences in reflected light. The retina contains 3 types of cone cells, each sensitive to different ranges of wavelength. The brain compares the activation levels of these 3 types and assigns a color based on that comparison. This system works well enough for survival, allowing quick distinction between ripe and unripe fruit, healthy and diseased foliage, clear and contaminated water. But it is a construction, not a revelation. This becomes obvious when examining edge cases. The color perceived depends not just on the wavelength reaching the eye, but on surrounding context. A grey square appears lighter when surrounded by black and darker when surrounded by white, even though the wavelength has not changed. This is the brain adjusting its interpretation based on assumptions about lighting conditions and surface properties. It is not being fooled. It is applying rules that usually improve accuracy. The fact that these rules can be exploited to create illusions simply reveals that perception is an active process rather than a passive one. Research on color perception, particularly studies conducted at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, has demonstrated that the brain's color system prioritizes stability over literal accuracy. It compensates for changes in ambient lighting so that objects appear to have consistent color, even when the wavelength reaching the eye varies significantly. A white shirt looks white indoors under incandescent light and outdoors under sunlight, even though the wavelength composition differs substantially. The brain infers the lighting conditions and adjusts its interpretation accordingly. This is extraordinarily useful. It means that objects can be recognized reliably across different environments. But it also means that what is seen is not what is there. It is what the brain has decided is most likely there, given the data and the context. Sound operates similarly. The cochlea converts air pressure waves into neural signals, but it does not deliver sound as experienced. It delivers frequency information, timing patterns, intensity levels. The brain takes this and constructs the perception of distinct sounds, localized in space, carrying meaning. When listening to speech, what is heard is not simply the acoustic pattern. It is the brain's interpretation of that pattern, shaped by expectations about language, context, and speaker identity. This is why the same acoustic signal can be heard as different words depending on what sentence it appears in. The brain is not detecting words, it is inferring them. Studies conducted at institutions like Johns Hopkins University and the University of Cambridge have shown that the brain often resolves ambiguous auditory input by favoring interpretations that fit expectations. In one classic experiment, participants hear a sentence with a cough obscuring a phoneme. They report hearing the complete word, not noticing that part of it was missing. The brain filled in the gap based on context, and the result felt indistinguishable from actual perception. This is not an error. It is the system working as designed, prioritizing coherent interpretation over literal transcription. Touch follows the same principle. The skin contains various receptors sensitive to pressure, vibration, temperature, and pain. These receptors send signals to the brain, but they do not send the feeling of texture or the sensation of an object's shape. The brain constructs these from patterns of activation, integrating information across time and space. When running fingers over a surface, the perception of smoothness or roughness emerges from how activation patterns change as the hand moves. The brain predicts what should be felt based on visual input, memory, and motor commands, and then checks those predictions against tactile data. This predictive aspect becomes especially clear in cases of phantom limb sensation, where individuals who have lost a limb continue to feel it. The brain's model of the body includes the limb, and in the absence of contradictory sensory input, that model persists. The person feels the limb move, feels it itch, feels pain in fingers that are not there. This is not imagination in the usual sense. It is perception, generated by the same neural processes that produce all perception, simply untethered from external input. The fact that this can happen reveals how much of what is felt comes from the brain's internal models rather than from the body itself. Research into phantom limbs, conducted at institutions like the University of California, San Diego, has led to treatments that exploit the brain's predictive nature. Mirror therapy, for example, uses visual feedback to convince the brain that the missing limb is present and moving. This can reduce phantom pain, not by changing anything in the body, but by updating the brain's model to align with a less painful state. The success of such treatments underscores that pain, like all sensory experience, is constructed by the brain and can be modified by changing the brain's predictions. Even the sense of where the body is in space, proprioception, depends on prediction. The brain does not wait for sensory feedback to know where the arm is. It predicts based on motor commands sent to muscles, and then uses sensory feedback to refine that prediction. This is why movement feels immediate and coordinated. If the brain had to wait for feedback before knowing where the limbs were, actions would be sluggish and clumsy. Instead, prediction allows fluid motion, with sensory input serving primarily to correct errors, rather than to provide the initial sense of position. Experiments using robotics and virtual reality, particularly those conducted at Stanford University and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, have demonstrated that the brain's sense of embodiment is flexible. When visual and tactile feedback are synchronized, people can be made to feel that a rubber hand or even a virtual body belongs to them. The brain accepts the new body into its predictive model, as long as the sensory input is consistent. This adaptability is remarkable, but it also highlights that the sense of having a body is not a direct readout of physical reality. It is an inference, updated continuously, generally accurate, but always constructed. Vision, being the dominant sense for most humans, offers especially rich examples of how prediction shapes perception. The eye does not capture a complete image of the visual field. It samples selectively, with high resolution, only at the center of gaze. The periphery is blurry, color information is sparse, and there are literal blind spots where the optic nerve exits the retina. yet the visual experience feels complete, detailed, and stable. This is because the brain fills in missing information based on expectations. It predicts what should be in the periphery based on what was seen there previously and what typically appears in such locations. Most of the time, these predictions are accurate enough that the gaps go unnoticed. Saccades, the rapid eye movements that shift gaze from one point to another, occur several times per second. During a saccade, vision is suppressed. The brain does not process the blur of motion. Instead, it stitches together a seamless experience by predicting what should be visible and ignoring the movement itself. This creates the illusion of continuous vision when the actual input is a series of discrete snapshots separated by blanks. Neuroscience research, including studies at New York University and the University of Tokyo, has shown that the brain even backdates perception, attributing events to moments before they were consciously registered in order to maintain the illusion of continuity. This manipulation of timing becomes especially clear in experiments involving reaction time. When a stimulus appears and a person presses a button in response, the subjective experience is that the decision to press happened after seeing the stimulus. Neuroimaging, however, shows that motor preparation begins before conscious awareness of the decision. The brain has already committed to the action, and consciousness catches up afterward, constructing a narrative in which the decision felt deliberate and timely. The experience is not false, exactly, but it is retrospectively assembled, rather than occurring in the order it seems to occur. Studies of this phenomenon, conducted at institutions like the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience and University College London, suggest that much of what feels like conscious decision-making is actually the brain's interpretation of processes that have already begun. This does not mean that free will is an illusion, but it does mean that the subjective timeline of events is constructed after the fact. The brain narrates its own activity, and that narration feels real because it is the only version accessible to awareness. Attention plays a critical role in determining what enters conscious experience. The brain cannot process all incoming sensory data in detail. There is too much of it. Instead, attention acts as a filter, prioritizing certain information and suppressing the rest. What is attended to becomes vivid and detailed. What is ignored effectively disappears from perception, even though the sensory data still arrives at the brain. It is an essential feature that allows the brain to allocate limited processing resources efficiently. The famous invisible gorilla experiment, conducted by researchers at Harvard University, demonstrates this dramatically. Participants watch a video of people passing a basketball and are asked to count the passes. While focused on this task, many fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. The gorilla is clearly visible, but attention is directed elsewhere, so it does not enter conscious awareness. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is doing what it is designed to do. Focus on what seems relevant and filter out what does not. This selective nature of attention reveals that consciousness is not a floodlight illuminating all of experience equally. It is a spotlight, narrow and directed, highlighting a small portion of what the brain is processing. The rest continues to be processed unconsciously, influencing behavior and decision-making without ever reaching awareness. Studies using brain imaging, particularly functional MRI, have shown that large areas of the brain remain active even when people report no conscious experience of certain stimuli. The activity is there, but it does not cross the threshold into awareness. Memory, too, is constructed rather than recorded. It feels like memory preserves the past, storing events as they happened and retrieving them when needed. Neuroscience shows that memory does not work this way. Each time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed from fragments, and the reconstruction process can introduce errors. Details shift. Events from different times merge, What is remembered is not the past itself, but the brain's current best guess about the past, based on fragments of stored information and present context. Research on memory reconsolidation, conducted at institutions like New York University and the University of Montreal, has demonstrated that recalling a memory makes it temporarily unstable, allowing it to be updated or altered. This is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable. Witnesses are not lying, but each time they recall an event, the memory can change slightly, influenced by suggestion, expectation, or subsequent information. After multiple retellings, the memory may bear little resemblance to the original event, yet it feels just as vivid and certain as it did initially. The brain's tendency to construct coherent narratives extends beyond individual memories to entire life stories. Autobiographical memory is not a faithful record of events. It is a curated collection of highlights, edited for coherence and meaning. Details are forgotten. The story told about one's own life is shaped by current identity, goals, and beliefs, and it shifts over time as those factors change. This is not dishonesty. It is the brain doing what it evolved to do: create useful narratives that support decision-making and social interaction. Studies on false memories, particularly those conducted at the University of California, Irvine, have shown that entirely fabricated events can be implanted through suggestion. People come to vividly remember things that never happened, complete with sensory details and emotional responses. This occurs because memory construction uses the same neural processes, whether the event being remembered actually occurred or not. The brain generates a plausible scenario based on available information, and if that scenario feels coherent, it is accepted as memory. There is no internal marker that distinguishes real memories from false ones. Both feel equally real because both are constructed in the same way. Even the sense of a continuous self, the feeling of being the same person over time, is a construction. Neurons are constantly being replaced. Synaptic connections change. Thoughts, beliefs, and preferences evolve. There is no single unchanging entity that persists from childhood to old age. Yet the brain creates the experience of continuity, stitching together past and present into a coherent identity. This serves an important function. It allows planning, maintains social relationships, and provides a framework for making sense of experience. But it is a narrative, not a fact. Research into self-perception, conducted at institutions like the University of Amsterdam and the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge, has shown that the sense of self is highly context-dependent. People describe themselves differently depending on who they are talking to, what role they are playing, and what aspects of identity are currently salient. There is no single true self being revealed. There are multiple self-representations, each constructed for specific purposes, and the brain switches between them fluidly, without any sense of inconsistency. The brain also constructs the sense of agency, the feeling of being in control of one's actions. This feels self-evident. Decisions are made, actions follow, and the connection between intention and outcome seems direct. Yet experiments have shown that the sense of agency can be manipulated. When visual feedback is delayed or distorted, people can be made to feel that they are controlling movements they are not actually making, or conversely, that they are not controlling movements they are making. The sense of agency is inferred rather than directly perceived. Studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation, a technique that allows researchers to temporarily disrupt activity in specific brain regions, have shown that interfering with certain areas can alter the sense of agency without affecting motor performance. The person can still perform actions, but the feeling of having initiated them disappears. This dissociation reveals that agency is a separate process, a judgment the brain makes about its own activity rather than an inherent property of action itself. Language offers another window into the brain's constructive nature. Speech does not simply encode thoughts that already exist fully formed. The process of speaking often clarifies and shapes thought in real time. People discover what they think by hearing themselves talk. Writing functions similarly. Ideas that felt vague. This suggests that thought itself is not a pre-existing internal monologue that language merely translates. It is something constructed through language, shaped by the constraints and possibilities of linguistic structure. Research on inner speech, conducted at institutions like the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Durham University, has shown that the brain's language areas are active even during silent thought. This is not simply a readout of existing ideas. It is the brain using language as a tool for thinking, structuring experience, and generating new concepts. The boundary between thought and language is less clear than intuition suggests. They are deeply intertwined, each shaping the other. Even the perception of time is constructed. It does not flow at a constant rate. Attention expands subjective time, making attended moments feel longer than ignored ones. Novelty stretches time, while routine compresses it. Looking back, a week filled with new experiences feels longer than a week of repetition, even though the same amount of clock time passed. The brain's time perception is not a passive clock. It is an active interpretation, influenced by attention, emotion, memory, and expectation. Studies on time perception, particularly those conducted at the University of Minnesota and the Karolinska Institute, have demonstrated that the brain does not have a single central clock. Different neural systems track time at different scales, and the subjective experience of duration emerges from their interaction. This is why time can seem to slow down during an accident or speed up during an engaging conversation. The brain is not measuring time in the way a stopwatch does. It is estimating duration based on how much information was processed, how much attention was allocated, and how events are encoded in memory. Sleep itself reveals the brain's predictive and constructive nature. During sleep, sensory input is reduced, but the brain remains active, generating dreams that feel real while they are happening. Dreams do not replay memories literally. They recombine elements from experience in novel ways, creating scenarios that follow dream logic rather than waking logic. Yet while dreaming, these scenarios are accepted as real. The brain constructs a world, populates it with characters and events, and experiences it as perception rather than imagination. Research on dreaming, conducted at institutions like the University of Bern and the Lyon Neuroscience Research Center, has shown that the neural activity during REM sleep resembles waking perception more than it resembles rest. Visual cortex is active, emotional centers are engaged, motor areas show patterns consistent with movement. Though the body remains paralyzed, the brain is doing in sleep what it does while awake, constructing experience. The only difference is that during sleep, there is no sensory input to constrain the construction, so it drifts into configurations that would be impossible while awake. Lucid dreaming, where the dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming without waking up, offers a particularly striking example of the brain's flexibility. In this state, the person can sometimes exert control over the dream, changing the environment or actions deliberately. Studies using EEG and fMRI, particularly those at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry, have shown that lucid dreaming involves increased activity in frontal brain regions associated with self-awareness and executive function. The brain is simultaneously constructing the dream and observing that construction, a kind of meta-awareness that is rare but demonstrates the layered nature of consciousness. All of this constructive activity happens automatically, beneath the threshold of awareness. The brain does not announce that it is predicting, filling in gaps, or revising interpretations. It simply delivers experience, and that experience feels immediate and direct. This is adaptive. If every perceptual inference had to be consciously evaluated, decision-making would be impossibly slow. Instead, the brain handles most processing unconsciously. presenting to awareness only the final product, a coherent, mostly accurate model of the world. The efficiency of this system is remarkable. The brain consumes about 20% of the body's energy, despite being only 2% of its weight. Much of that energy goes not to processing new sensory input, but to maintaining ongoing predictions and updating them when necessary. This is a significant investment, but it pays off in speed and accuracy. Predictions allow the brain to respond to the world faster than would be possible if it had to build interpretations from scratch each time. Research into predictive coding, a theoretical framework developed at institutions like University College London and the Wellcome Centre for Human Neuroimaging, describes this process mathematically. According to predictive coding, the brain constantly generates predictions about incoming sensory data and compares those predictions to what actually arrives. When predictions match, the brain suppresses the sensory signal since it is already accounted for. Only prediction errors, mismatches between expectation and reality, are processed in detail. This reduces the amount of information the brain has to handle, making the system more efficient. This framework explains many perceptual phenomena. Repetition suppression, for example, is the observation that neurons respond less strongly to repeated stimuli. This is not fatigue, it is prediction. After the first presentation, the brain expects the stimulus to repeat, so subsequent presentations generate smaller prediction errors and thus weaker neural responses. Similarly, the brain's tendency to perceive patterns even in random noise can be understood as predictions outweighing weak sensory evidence. When input is ambiguous, predictions dominate, and the result is that people see faces in clouds, hear words in static, and find meaning in randomness. Illusions are not failures of perception. They are the system working as designed, making inferences based on assumptions that usually hold but occasionally do not. The Muller-Lyer illusion, where two lines of equal length appear different because of the orientation of arrow-like fins at their ends, exploits assumptions the brain makes about perspective and depth. In three-dimensional environments, such configurations typically indicate that one line is farther away than the other, and the brain adjusts perceived size accordingly. On a flat page, this adjustment is inappropriate, but the brain applies it anyway because it is applying rules that usually improve accuracy. Studies of illusions, conducted at institutions like MIT and the Vision Sciences Laboratory at Harvard, have shown that even when people know an illusion is occurring, perception does not change. The brain continues to apply its predictive rules despite conscious knowledge that they are leading to error. This demonstrates that much of perception is not under conscious control. It is automatic, driven by processes that evolved to prioritize speed and utility over literal accuracy. Cultural and experiential factors shape prediction, which is why perception is not entirely universal. People raised in environments with lots of straight lines and right angles, like modern cities, are more susceptible to certain geometric illusions than people raised in environments with more organic shapes. The brain learns statistical regularities from experience and incorporates them into its predictive models. What is expected, and therefore what is perceived, varies depending on what has been encountered repeatedly. Research into cross-cultural perception, conducted at institutions like the University of Michigan and Hokkaido University, has shown that people from different cultures literally see the world differently. East Asian participants tend to allocate more attention to context and background, while Western participants focus more on central objects. This is not a difference in visual hardware. It is a difference in learned attention patterns, shaped by cultural practices and social norms. The brain's predictions reflect not just individual experience, but also the broader cultural environment. Language influences perception in subtle ways. Some languages have separate words for what English calls blue, distinguishing lighter and darker shades as distinct categories. Speakers of such languages are faster at discriminating those shades perceptually. The linguistic categories shape the perceptual categories, demonstrating that language is not simply a label applied after perception. It actively structures how sensory input is organized and interpreted. Studies on linguistic relativity, particularly those conducted at Stanford University and the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, have shown that language influences not just color perception, but also spatial reasoning, time perception, and even causal attribution. The language spoken does not determine thought in a rigid way, but it does bias attention and interpretation, subtly shaping how the world is perceived and remembered. Emotions also shape perception. When anxious, people are more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as threatening. When happy, positive interpretations are favored. This is not simply a matter of judgment. It affects perception itself. Brain imaging studies have shown that emotional states modulate activity in sensory processing areas, changing how input is processed before it reaches awareness. The world looks different depending on emotional state. Not metaphorically, but literally, because the brain's predictions are biased by current effect. Research on emotion and perception, conducted at institutions like the University of Geneva and the Affective Neuroscience Laboratory at Columbia University, has demonstrated that even low-level perceptual processes like brightness perception can be influenced by emotion. A room appears darker when someone is afraid. This is the brain adjusting its interpretation based on the assumption that threats are more likely in dim environments. The adjustment happens automatically, without conscious intent, as part of the predictive process. Social perception offers another layer of complexity. When looking at faces, the brain does not simply process visual features. It infers mental states, intentions, emotions, and trustworthiness, often in a fraction of a second. These inferences are not always accurate, but they are fast and automatic, allowing rapid social navigation. The brain treats faces as especially important, allocating dedicated neural circuits to process them and making inferences that go far beyond the visual data available. Studies on face perception, conducted at institutions like the University of Haifa and the Dartmouth Social Perception Lab, have shown that people can make surprisingly consistent judgments about traits like trustworthiness or competence from faces, even though these judgments are often wrong. The brain is extracting patterns that correlate weakly with actual traits, but the correlation is strong enough that the system persists. This is prediction in a social domain, using visual cues to infer invisible properties. The brain's social predictions extend to predicting others' actions and intentions. Mirror neurons, discovered at the University of Parma, activate both when performing an action and when observing someone else perform the same action. This has led to theories that the brain simulates others' actions internally as a way of understanding them. By predicting what someone else will do based on one's own motor repertoire, the brain can infer goals and intentions. This is not mind reading. It is inference based on similarity, assuming that others' brains work in roughly the same way. Research into theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others, has shown that dedicated brain networks, including regions in the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction, are involved in social prediction. These networks develop during childhood and are essential for social interaction. Difficulties with theory of mind, as seen in some individuals with autism spectrum conditions, make social situations harder to navigate because the predictive machinery that typically makes others' behavior interpretable is less reliable. The brain's predictive nature even extends to controlling the body's internal state. Interoception, the sense of the body's internal condition, is not a direct readout of physiological signals. It is an inference. The brain predicts what the body should feel like based on activity level, environment, and context, and then checks those predictions against signals from the viscera. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, and arousal are all constructed experiences, shaped as much by expectation as by actual physiological state. Studies on interoception, conducted at institutions like the University of Sussex and the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, have shown that people vary widely in how accurately they perceive their own internal states. Some are highly attuned, noticing subtle changes in heart rate or breathing. Others are less aware, relying more on context and expectation to infer how they should feel. This variability suggests that interoception is not simply a matter of physiology. It is a skill, influenced by attention, learning, and the brain's predictive models. Even the immune system is influenced by the brain's predictions. Placebo effects, where inert treatments produce real physiological changes, demonstrate that expectation can alter bodily processes. When someone believes they have received pain medication, pain decreases, not just subjectively, but measurably, with changes in brain activity and even immune markers. The brain's prediction that pain should decrease leads it to suppress pain signals and release endogenous opioids. The expectation creates the reality within limits. Research on placebo effects, particularly studies conducted at Harvard Medical School and the University of Maryland, has shown that the strength of the effect depends on how strong the expectation is. Larger pills work better than smaller ones. Injections work better than pills. Expensive treatments work better than cheap ones. None of this makes physiological sense, but it makes psychological sense. The brain's predictions are influenced by cultural associations, and those predictions alter physiology. The flip side of placebo is nocebo, where negative expectations create harm. Warnings about side effects can cause those side effects to appear, even in people receiving inert substances. The brain predicts discomfort based on the warning, and that prediction manifests as actual experience. This is not imagination. It involves measurable changes in neural activity, and in some cases, physiological measures like heart rate and stress hormones. All of this reveals that the boundary between mind and body is less clear than it seems. The brain does not simply observe the body's state, it actively shapes that state through prediction. This has implications for health. Stress, for instance, is not just a response to external circumstances. It is also shaped by how those circumstances are interpreted, what is expected, and what the brain predicts about its ability to cope. Changing predictions through therapy, mindfulness, or shifts in perspective can alter stress responses even when circumstances remain the same. Research into stress and prediction, conducted at institutions like Stanford University and the University of California, San Francisco, has shown that people who view stress as enhancing rather than debilitating show different physiological responses. Their cardiovascular systems respond in ways associated with challenge rather than threat. The external stressor is the same, but the internal response differs because the prediction differs. This is the brain shaping bodily experience through interpretation. Pain is another area where prediction plays a critical role. Chronic pain often persists long after tissue damage has healed. This is not malingering. It is the brain continuing to predict pain based on past experience. And those predictions generate genuine pain signals. Treatments that disrupt the prediction, such as graded motor imagery or cognitive behavioral therapy, can reduce pain without addressing any structural issue. The pain was real, but it was generated by prediction, and altering the prediction alters the pain. Studies on chronic pain, particularly those conducted at the University of South Australia and the Neuroscience Research Australia, have demonstrated that the brain's pain system becomes sensitized over time, lowering the threshold for what triggers pain and expanding the areas that produce it. This is neuroplasticity in an unhelpful direction, where the brain has learned to predict pain too readily. Reversing this requires retraining the predictive system, essentially teaching the brain that the threat has passed and pain is no longer necessary. Neuroplasticity, The brain's ability to reorganize itself in response to experience underpins all of this constructive activity. The brain is not fixed in structure or function. It changes continuously, forming new connections, strengthening some pathways, and weakening others. This allows learning, adaptation, and recovery from injury. But it also means that the brain's predictive models are always evolving. What is expected today may not be what is expected tomorrow, and perception shifts accordingly. Research into neuroplasticity, conducted at institutions like the University of California, San Francisco, and the Taub Institute at Columbia University, has shown that even in adulthood, the brain retains significant capacity for change. Stroke patients can recover lost functions by recruiting new brain areas to take over damaged ones. Musicians develop enhanced auditory and motor areas through years of practice. Learning a new language reshapes language networks. The brain is not a static machine. It is a dynamic system, continuously remodeling itself based on experience. This plasticity is both empowering and humbling. It means that change is possible, that the brain can adapt to new circumstances, learn new skills, and even recover from damage. But it also means that what feels like unchanging reality is actually a temporary configuration. Perception, memory, thought, and emotion are all products of a system that is constantly updating itself, and the stability of experience is an achievement, not a given. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region most associated with executive function and conscious control, develops slowly, not reaching full maturity until the mid-20s. This late development suggests that much of what the brain does early in life is automatic and driven by subcortical structures. The capacity for deliberate reflection, planning, and inhibition comes later. Even in adulthood, prefrontal control is effortful and limited. Most of the time, behavior is guided by automatic processes, and conscious reflection is invoked only when something unexpected occurs. Studies on executive function, conducted at institutions like the University of Oregon and the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London, have shown that tasks requiring sustained attention, working memory, or inhibition deplete mental resources. After exerting cognitive control, people perform worse on subsequent tasks requiring control. This is mental fatigue, and it suggests that the brain's default mode is not effortful deliberation, but automatic processing. Conscious thought is expensive, and the brain economizes by relying on it sparingly. The default mode network, a set of brain regions active during rest and internally focused thought, becomes active when the brain is not engaged in a specific task. This network is involved in mind-wandering, self-referential thinking, and memory consolidation. It was once thought of as idle activity, but research has shown it plays an important role in integrating information, planning, and maintaining a sense of self. When this network is disrupted, as in certain psychiatric conditions, the sense of continuity and coherence can be affected. Research on the default mode network, particularly studies conducted at Washington University in St. Louis and the University of Southern California, has shown that this network is not passive. It actively generates predictions about future events, constructs narratives about the self, and organizes memories into coherent patterns. It is part of the brain's predictive machinery, running simulations when external demands are low, essentially practicing for future situations. The interaction between the default mode network and task-positive networks, which activate during goal-directed activity, is dynamic. The brain shifts between them depending on context, sometimes favoring internal reflection, other times focusing on external tasks. Difficulties in making these transitions are associated with various mental health conditions, suggesting that the balance between internal and external focus is critical for well-being. Meditation and mindfulness practices, which have been studied extensively at institutions like the University of Massachusetts Medical School and the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences alter activity in these networks. Regular practice reduces default mode activity during rest and enhances the ability to sustain attention. This is not simply a subjective change. It is measurable in brain structure and function, with increases in grey matter density in regions associated with attention and decreases in regions associated with mind wandering. These changes demonstrate that the brain's predictive models can be intentionally shaped. By repeatedly directing attention in specific ways, the brain learns new patterns, and those patterns become easier to access over time. This is how skills are developed, habits are formed, and perspectives shift. The brain is not a passive receiver of experience. It is an active participant, and the way it participates can be influenced. All of this brings the discussion back to the central theme. The brain constructs experience rather than recording it. This is not a limitation. It is what allows the brain to function efficiently in a complex, changing world. By predicting rather than simply reacting, the brain stays ahead of events, responding to what is likely to happen rather than waiting for confirmation. This speed comes at the cost of occasional error, but on balance, prediction is far more effective than passive reception. The world experienced is not the world that exists in some absolute sense. It is the world as interpreted by a particular brain, shaped by evolution, culture, individual history, and current context. Other animals experience different worlds because their sensory systems sample different aspects of the environment, and their brains make different predictions. A bat experiences space through echolocation. A bee sees ultraviolet patterns invisible to humans. A dog's world is dominated by scent in ways that are difficult to imagine. None of these experiences is more true than the others. They are all constructed, each tailored to the needs and capacities of the organism. Neuroscience does not diminish the richness of experience by revealing its constructed nature. If anything, it deepens appreciation for what the brain accomplishes. Every moment of coherent perception, every retrieved memory, every decision made, involves vast networks of neurons coordinating across milliseconds, integrating information from multiple sources, and generating predictions that align closely enough with reality to allow effective action. This is an extraordinary achievement, happening continuously, mostly without error and entirely without conscious oversight. The fact that perception is constructed does not make it unreliable. The brain's predictions are based on billions of years of evolutionary refinement and a lifetime of learning. They are, on average, highly accurate. When they fail, the system corrects quickly, updating models and adjusting expectations. The universe remains stable and predictable, and the brain's constructed experience reflects that stability, reliably enough for survival, and often for much more. There is a kind of humility in recognizing that what is experienced is not reality itself, but a model, one that is useful, mostly accurate, but always provisional. This opens space for curiosity rather than certainty. It allows for the possibility that others' experiences, constructed by different brains with different histories, might be equally valid even when they differ. It invites patience with the limits of understanding, acknowledging that the brain is doing its best with incomplete information, and that sometimes its best is still a guess. The brain's predictive nature also offers reassurance. The world does not need to be fully understood to be navigated effectively. The brain manages complexity by simplifying, predicting, and filling in gaps. And this works well enough for nearly everything that matters. There is no requirement for perfect perception or complete knowledge. Approximations suffice, and the brain is extraordinarily good at generating useful approximations. As neuroscience continues to map the brain's structure and function, the picture that emerges is not of a machine that passively receives and processes information, but of a system that actively constructs experience, moment by moment, based on predictions refined by sensory data. This is how the brain makes sense of a world that is far too complex to be fully represented, far too fast-changing to be completely tracked, and far too ambiguous to be interpreted without assumptions. The brain does not apologize for this. It simply continues, generating experience, updating models, and allowing the organism to act. And in doing so, it creates the vivid, coherent, mostly reliable world that feels like direct perception, but is in fact an ongoing act of construction, quiet, automatic, and utterly essential. The universe remains stable. The brain's predictions align with it closely enough to function. An understanding deepens not by pretending that experience is unmediated, but by recognizing the extraordinary process that makes it possible. Mystery persists, but so does reliability. The brain builds the world as experienced, and that world, constructed though it is, remains dependable enough to trust. The constructed nature of experience has practical implications worth exploring. Learning, for instance, is not simply the acquisition of facts. It is the modification of the brain's predictive models. When something new is encountered, the brain's predictions fail, generating prediction errors that drive learning. The larger the error, the more the model is updated. This is why surprise is such a powerful learning signal. Unexpected events capture attention and trigger memory formation in ways that predictable events do not. Research on learning and memory, conducted at institutions like the Center for Neuroscience at NYU and the Donders Institute in the Netherlands, has shown that prediction errors activate dopamine neurons, which signal that something important has occurred and that models should be updated. This is why teaching methods that introduce controlled surprise, such as asking questions before providing answers or presenting counterintuitive examples, tend to be more effective than passive presentation. The brain is wired to learn from mismatch, and educational approaches that exploit this tend to produce stronger retention. Expertise changes how the brain predicts. Novices and experts looking at the same situation generate different predictions based on different models built through different amounts of experience. A chess master sees patterns that a beginner does not because of better vision, but because of better predictions about what configurations are meaningful. A radiologist detects abnormalities that others miss because their brain has learned what healthy tissue should look like and flags deviations automatically. Studies on perceptual expertise, particularly those conducted at Vanderbilt University and Carnegie Mellon University, have shown that expert perception involves both enhanced sensitivity to relevant features and reduced sensitivity to irrelevant ones. The brain tunes its predictions to emphasize what matters for the task at hand, essentially creating a specialized perceptual world. This is efficient, but also means that experts sometimes miss things that novices notice because their predictions are so specific that they filter out unexpected information. The phenomenon of inattentional blindness, where people fail to notice salient stimuli when attention is focused elsewhere, reveals the limits of the brain's predictive system. Attention shapes what predictions are generated and refined, and anything outside the focus of attention may not be predicted at all. This is why radiologists can miss a gorilla superimposed on a lung scan when they are looking for tumors. The brain predicts tumors, not gorillas, so the gorilla does not enter awareness. Research on attention and awareness, conducted at institutions like the University of British Columbia and the Visual Attention Lab at Harvard, has demonstrated that attention is necessary but not sufficient for awareness. Even attended stimuli sometimes fail to reach consciousness if they do not generate sufficient prediction error or if attention is divided across too many targets. The brain's capacity is limited, and when those limits are reached, even important information can be missed. Multitasking, despite its ubiquity, is inefficient precisely because of these limits. The brain does not actually process multiple complex tasks simultaneously. It switches rapidly between them, and each switch incurs a cost. Predictions have to be updated, context has to be reloaded, and performance on both tasks suffers compared to focused, single-task performance. Studies at the University of Michigan and Stanford University have shown that people consistently overestimate their ability to multitask, believing they are performing well when objective measures show significant impairment. This overconfidence reflects the brain's tendency to construct a coherent experience, even when the underlying processing is fragmented. The subjective experience of multitasking feels smooth because the brain stitches together the fragments and fills in gaps, just as it does with vision during saccades. The inefficiency is hidden from awareness, and the person genuinely feels productive even when they are not. Sleep deprivation degrades the brain's predictive accuracy. When sleep deprived, people make more errors in perception, memory, and decision-making. This is not simply fatigue in the sense of low energy. It is a breakdown in the brain's ability to maintain and update its models effectively. Predictions become less accurate, attention becomes harder to sustain, and the capacity to suppress irrelevant information diminishes. Research on sleep and cognition, conducted at institutions like the University of California, Berkeley, and the Center for Sleep and Cognition at Harvard Medical School, has shown that sleep plays a critical role in consolidating memories and refining predictive models. During sleep, the brain replays patterns of activity from waking experience, strengthening useful connections and pruning less useful ones. Without adequate sleep, this maintenance process is disrupted, and cognitive performance deteriorates. The experience of being sleep-deprived often includes a subjective sense that thinking is harder, that attention wanders more easily, and that simple tasks require more effort. This is accurate self-perception. The brain is working less efficiently, and the increased effort required to maintain predictive accuracy becomes noticeable. Yet even in this state, the brain continues to construct experience, though the quality of that construction is compromised. Dreams, which occur primarily during REM sleep, but can also occur in other sleep stages, demonstrate the brain's capacity to generate complex, coherent narratives in the absence of external input. Dream content is often bizarre, violating physical laws and social norms in ways that would be immediately recognized as impossible while awake. Yet, during the dream, these violations are accepted without question. The brain's reality monitoring system, which normally flags implausible events, is less active during sleep, allowing predictions to wander into impossible configurations. Research on dream content, conducted at institutions like the University of Montreal and the Dream and Nightmare Laboratory at the Montreal Sacred Heart Hospital, has shown that dreams often incorporate elements from recent waking experience, recombined in novel ways. This supports the idea that sleep helps consolidate memories by exploring different ways that stored information can be related. The strangeness of dreams may reflect the brain testing associations that would be inhibited during waking thought. Nightmares, which are distressing dreams that often wake the sleeper, may represent a failure of the brain's emotional regulation during sleep. The predictions generated during the dream trigger strong negative emotions, and the emotional response becomes intense enough to disrupt sleep. Chronic nightmares are associated with various psychiatric conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, suggesting that the brain's predictive models can become biased toward threatening content when shaped by traumatic experience. Studies on nightmare treatment, particularly those conducted at the University of Amsterdam and the Center for Sleep Research at the University of Western Australia, have shown that rehearsal techniques, where the person imagines a different, less distressing outcome for the nightmare while awake, this works by updating the brain's predictive models, essentially retraining them to generate different content. The fact that deliberately practiced alternatives can reshape dreams underscores the flexibility of the brain's generative processes. The transition between sleep and waking is not always sharp. Hypnagogic hallucinations, which occur while falling asleep, and hypnopompic hallucinations, which occur while waking up, represent states where the brain is generating dreamlike content while some awareness persists. People may see patterns, hear voices, or feel presences that are not there. These are not signs of pathology. They are the brain's predictive system operating in a transitional state where external input is reduced, but not entirely absent. Research on these phenomena, conducted at institutions like the University of Waterloo and the Sapienza University of Rome, has shown that hypnagogic experiences are more common when people are sleep-deprived, stressed, or lying in unusual positions. The brain is trying to make sense of reduced and ambiguous sensory input, and the predictions it generates can feel vividly real. This is the same process that produces perception during waking, simply operating under different conditions. Consciousness itself, the subjective quality of experience, remains one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. The brain can be studied in exquisite detail. Neural activity can be measured. Connections can be mapped. Yet how all of this activity produces the felt quality of seeing red, feeling pain, or experiencing joy is not fully understood. This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, distinguishing it from easier problems like explaining how the brain processes visual information or controls movement. Research on consciousness, conducted at institutions like the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Consciousness and Brain Group at the Sorbonne, has identified certain neural correlates of consciousness, patterns of brain activity that reliably accompany conscious experience. These include widespread activity across multiple brain regions, recurrent processing, where information cycles through networks rather than flowing in one direction, and specific patterns of neural synchronization. Yet, identifying correlates is not the same as explaining why those patterns produce subjective experience. Some researchers propose that consciousness emerges from integrated information, the idea that systems become conscious when they integrate information in certain ways. Others suggest that consciousness is related to the brain's ability to model itself, creating representations not just of the world, but of its own states. Still others argue that consciousness may be fundamental, not something produced by the brain, but something the brain taps into or expresses. These remain open questions, areas where neuroscience has made progress, but has not yet reached consensus. What is clear is that consciousness is not a single thing. It includes many components: wakefulness, awareness of the environment, self-awareness, attention, memory, emotion, and the sense of agency. Each of these can be affected independently by brain injury or disease. People in vegetative states may be awake but show no signs of awareness. People with certain types of amnesia may be fully conscious in the moment but unable to form new memories. People with anosognosia may be unaware of deficits that are obvious to others. Consciousness is not unitary. It is a collection of processes that usually work together but can be dissociated. Studies on disorders of consciousness, conducted at institutions like the University of Liège and the Weill Cornell Medical College, have used brain imaging to detect signs of awareness in patients who cannot communicate. In some cases, patients who appear unresponsive show brain activity patterns consistent with understanding language and even responding to questions by imagining specific actions. This hidden consciousness, trapped without a means of expression, is profoundly challenging both scientifically and ethically. It demonstrates that behavior and consciousness can come apart, that the brain may be generating experience even when no outward sign is visible. Anesthesia provides another window into consciousness. Anesthetic drugs do not simply suppress brain activity uniformly. They disrupt specific patterns of connectivity, particularly long-range communication between distant brain regions. This fragmentation prevents the integration of information across the brain, and consciousness fades even though local neural activity continues. The person is not asleep in the usual sense. They are in a state where the brain's predictive and integrative processes are chemically interrupted. Research on anesthesia, conducted at institutions like the University of Michigan Medical School and Imperial College London, has shown that different anesthetics affect the brain in different ways, but all produce unconsciousness by disrupting the coordinated activity that characterizes waking awareness. Monitoring these disruptions helps anesthesiologists ensure that patients remain unconscious during surgery, while minimizing the dose needed, reducing side effects, and improving safety. The brain's remarkable capacity for self-repair and adaptation becomes especially evident following injury, stroke, traumatic brain injury, and neurodegenerative diseases. All damage neural tissue, yet recovery is often possible to some degree. The brain compensates by recruiting undamaged areas to take over lost functions, strengthening alternative pathways, and reorganizing its networks. This plasticity is most pronounced in children, but persists throughout life, though the extent and speed of recovery decline with age. Research on brain injury and recovery, conducted at institutions like the Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute and the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, has shown that rehabilitation is most effective when it involves intensive, task-specific practice. The brain needs repeated prediction errors in the domain being relearned in order to update its models effectively. Simply resting does not drive recovery. Active engagement, even when difficult and effortful, is what shapes the brain's reorganization. This principle applies beyond injury. Skill acquisition at any age involves neuroplastic change. Learning a musical instrument, a new language, or a complex motor skill all reshape the brain in measurable ways. Grey matter density increases in relevant regions. White matter connections strengthen. The brain literally changes its structure in response to experience, and those changes enable improved performance. Studies on skill learning, particularly those conducted at University College London and the University of Zurich, have shown that the most significant brain changes occur during early stages of learning, when prediction errors are frequent and large. As skill develops and performance becomes more automatic, brain activity becomes more efficient, with less widespread activation and more focused engagement of specialized regions. Expertise is not just better performance, it is a different pattern of brain organization. The brain's predictive machinery also underlies creativity. Generating novel ideas involves recombining elements in new ways, exploring possibilities that have not been encountered before. This is not random. It is guided by the brain's learned patterns and constraints, but it allows variation within those constraints. Creative insights often involve making connections between domains that are not usually linked, seeing analogies, and applying solutions from one context to another. Research on creativity, conducted at institutions like the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the Creativity Research Lab at Penn State, has shown that creative thinking is associated with increased connectivity between brain regions that do not typically interact during more routine tasks. The default mode network, which generates internally focused thought, interacts more strongly with networks involved in cognitive control and attention. This allows novel associations to be formed while still being evaluated for usefulness. The experience of insight, the sudden realization of a solution, feels qualitatively different from incremental problem solving. It often arrives seemingly out of nowhere, accompanied by a sense of certainty and sometimes pleasure. Brain imaging studies have shown that moments of insight are preceded by specific patterns of neural activity, including a burst of high-frequency gamma waves in the right temporal lobe just before the insight reaches awareness. This suggests that the solution was being processed unconsciously before breaking into consciousness. Incubation, the phenomenon where stepping away from a problem and returning later leads to solutions, reflects the brain's ongoing processing during rest. The brain does not stop working on problems simply because conscious attention has moved elsewhere. Background processing continues, exploring possibilities and testing combinations. When a viable solution emerges, it surfaces into awareness, creating the experience of sudden insight. Studies on incubation, conducted at institutions like the University of Sydney and Carnegie Mellon University, have shown that taking breaks during problem solving can improve performance, especially on problems requiring creative thinking. The break allows the brain to escape fixation on ineffective approaches and explore alternatives. This is not procrastination. It is a productive phase of unconscious processing. The social brain, the networks involved in understanding and interacting with others, is one of the most sophisticated aspects of human cognition. Humans are exquisitely sensitive to social cues, capable of inferring complex mental states from minimal information, and motivated to cooperate and compete in ways that shape behavior profoundly. This capacity relies on predictive processes that model not just the physical world. Research on social cognition, conducted at institutions like the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Social Brain Lab at the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience, has shown that understanding others involves simulating their perspective, predicting their actions, and inferring their intentions. This is not telepathy. It is inference based on observation, context, and theory of mind. The brain assumes that others have beliefs, desires, and goals, and it uses those assumptions to make sense of their behavior. Empathy, the capacity to share and understand others' emotions, involves both cognitive and affective components. Cognitive empathy is the ability to infer what someone else is feeling. Affective empathy is the tendency to feel what they are feeling. Psychopathy, for instance, involves intact cognitive empathy but reduced affective empathy, allowing accurate prediction of others' emotions without sharing them. Autism spectrum conditions sometimes involve the opposite pattern, with intact or heightened affective empathy, but difficulties with cognitive empathy. Studies on empathy, conducted at institutions like the University of Chicago and the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, have shown that empathy is not a single system, but a collection of processes that can be enhanced or diminished through experience. Healthcare professionals, for example, can become desensitized to patient suffering through repeated exposure, a protective mechanism that prevents emotional burnout, but can also reduce compassionate response. Training that emphasizes perspective-taking can counteract this desensitization. Moral judgment, the capacity to distinguish right from wrong and to evaluate behavior, also involves predictive processes. The brain predicts the consequences of actions, assigns emotional value to those consequences, and integrates social norms and personal values to reach a judgment. Different people reach different judgments about the same situation because their predictions are shaped by different experiences, cultures, and emotional tendencies. Research on moral cognition, conducted at institutions like Harvard University and the University of Oxford, has shown that moral judgments are influenced by emotion more than people typically realize. Disgust, for instance, can make moral judgments harsher, even when the disgust is incidental and unrelated to the moral issue. This is the brain's affective predictions biasing cognitive evaluation, a reminder that reason and emotion are not separate systems, but deeply intertwined. The development of the brain from infancy through adulthood involves a long process of refinement. At birth, the brain has far more neural connections than it will have in adulthood. Development involves pruning, selectively strengthening useful connections, and eliminating less useful ones based on experience. This sculpting process is experience-dependent, meaning that the environment shapes the brain's structure in fundamental ways. Research on brain development, conducted at institutions like the National Institute of Mental Health and the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit, has shown that different brain regions mature at different rates. Sensory and motor areas develop early, while prefrontal regions responsible for executive function mature much later. This extended development means that adolescents have adult-like sensory and emotional processing, but still developing cognitive control. a mismatch that helps explain increased risk-taking during this period. Language acquisition during childhood demonstrates the brain's capacity for learning through prediction error. Infants are exposed to a continuous stream of sounds, and they gradually learn to segment this stream into words, infer grammatical rules, and map sounds to meanings. They do this without explicit instruction, simply by detecting statistical regularities and testing predictions. When predictions fail, the model is updated, and over time, a functional language system emerges. Studies on language development, conducted at institutions like MIT and the University of Maryland, have shown that infants are sensitive to patterns in language from a very early age. By 6 months, they can distinguish phonemes from their native language better than phonemes from other languages, showing that the brain has already begun tuning its predictions to the specific language environment. This early specialization is efficient, but also means that learning new sounds later in life is harder because the brain's predictive models are already optimized for a different set of distinctions. Bilingualism, which involves maintaining 2 language systems, reshapes the brain in specific ways. Bilingual individuals show enhanced executive function, particularly in tasks requiring cognitive control and switching between tasks. This is thought to result from the constant practice of managing 2 languages, selecting the appropriate one for context and inhibiting the other. The brain adapts to this demand by strengthening relevant control networks. Research on bilingualism, conducted at institutions like Northwestern University and the University of Houston, has shown that these cognitive benefits extend into older age, with bilingual individuals showing delayed onset of dementia symptoms compared to monolingual individuals. The mechanism is not fully understood, but it likely involves cognitive reserve, the brain's resilience to damage. Managing 2 languages provides ongoing mental exercise that builds and maintains neural networks, offering some protection against age-related decline. Aging affects the brain in predictable ways. Processing speed slows. Working memory capacity declines. The ability to filter out irrelevant information diminishes. Yet many aspects of cognition remain stable or even improve with age. Vocabulary continues to expand. Emotional regulation often improves. Wisdom, the capacity to apply knowledge and experience to complex life decisions, tends to increase. Research on cognitive aging, conducted at institutions like the University of Michigan and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, has shown that the brain compensates for age-related decline by recruiting additional regions to accomplish tasks that once required less effort. Older adults often show more bilateral activation, using both hemispheres for tasks that younger adults accomplish with one. This is not inefficiency. It is adaptive compensation, maintaining performance despite underlying neural changes. The distinction between fluid intelligence, the ability to solve novel problems, and crystallized intelligence, accumulated knowledge and skills, is particularly relevant to aging. Fluid intelligence peaks in early adulthood and declines gradually thereafter. Crystallized intelligence continues to grow throughout life as long as the person remains engaged and learning. Older adults may be slower to solve unfamiliar problems, but faster to recognize situations they have encountered before and to apply relevant knowledge. Neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disrupt the brain's predictive processes in profound ways. Memory loss is often the first sign, reflecting damage to the hippocampus and related structures essential for forming new memories. As the disease progresses, predictions become less accurate, perception becomes more confused, and the ability to navigate both physical and social environments deteriorates. The person may fail to recognize familiar faces, forget recent conversations, and lose the ability to perform routine tasks. Research on Alzheimer's disease, conducted at institutions like the Mayo Clinic and University College London, has shown that pathological changes in the brain including amyloid plaques and tau tangles, begin years or even decades before symptoms appear. This long preclinical phase offers a potential window for intervention, but developing effective treatments has proven extraordinarily difficult. The brain's complexity and the disease's progressive nature make it a formidable challenge. Parkinson's disease, which primarily affects movement, also involves disruption of the brain's predictive systems. The loss of dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra impairs the brain's ability to initiate and coordinate movements. Predictions about what movements should feel like and how they should unfold become less reliable, leading to tremor, rigidity, and difficulty with voluntary action. Treatment with dopamine replacement can partially restore function, but it does not stop the underlying degeneration. Studies on Parkinson's disease, conducted at institutions like the Michael J. Fox Foundation and the University of Pennsylvania, have shown that the disease also affects cognition and emotion, not just movement. Many people with Parkinson's develop depression, anxiety, or cognitive impairment. This reflects the widespread role of dopamine in the brain, involved not just in motor control, but also in motivation, reward, and prediction error signaling. Psychiatric conditions also involve alterations in the brain's predictive processes. Depression is associated with biased predictions that favor negative outcomes, reduced sensitivity to reward, and difficulty imagining positive futures. Anxiety involves overestimation of threat and catastrophic prediction errors that drive avoidance behavior. Schizophrenia includes disrupted predictions about agency, leading to experiences where thoughts or actions feel externally controlled, and disrupted perceptual predictions, leading to hallucinations. Research on psychiatric disorders, conducted at institutions like the National Institute of Mental Health and King's College London, has shown that these conditions involve measurable changes in brain structure and function. Imaging studies reveal differences in connectivity, activity patterns, and neurotransmitter systems. Yet psychiatric diagnosis remains based primarily on symptoms rather than biology, reflecting the complexity of mapping brain states to subjective experience. Treatment for psychiatric conditions often involves changing the brain's predictive models, either through medication that alters neurotransmitter levels, or through therapy that restructures thought patterns and behaviors. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, explicitly targets maladaptive predictions, teaching people to notice when their expectations are unrealistically negative and to test alternative interpretations. This is prediction error training, deliberately generating experiences that contradict unhelpful models. Studies on psychotherapy, conducted at institutions like the University of Pennsylvania and the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London, have shown that effective therapy produces measurable changes in brain activity. Regions involved in emotional regulation show altered patterns, and connectivity between prefrontal and limbic regions shifts. The therapeutic process is not just psychological, it is neurobiological, reshaping the brain's predictive machinery through systematic experience. Meditation, particularly mindfulness meditation, also alters the brain's predictive processes. By training attention to focus on present experience without judgment, meditation reduces the tendency to ruminate on past events or worry about future ones. This shifts the brain away from habitual prediction and toward direct observation of what is currently happening. Over time, this practice changes brain structure and function in measurable ways. Research on meditation, conducted at institutions like the University of Massachusetts Medical School and the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, has shown that regular practitioners show increased grey matter density in regions associated with attention and decreased density in regions associated with stress response. They also show altered default mode network activity, with less mind-wandering during rest. These changes suggest that meditation is not just a temporary state, but a form of brain training that produces lasting effects. The brain's response to trauma provides another example of prediction shaping experience. After a traumatic event, the brain's threat detection system becomes hyperactive, predicting danger in situations that are objectively safe. This leads to hypervigilance, exaggerated startle responses, and intrusive memories. The person is not choosing to feel this way. The brain's predictive models have been updated to prioritize survival in an environment perceived as threatening, and those models persist even after the threat has passed. Research on post-traumatic stress disorder, conducted at institutions like the VA National Center for PTSD and McLean Hospital, has shown that effective treatment involves gradually updating the brain's threat predictions through exposure to trauma-related cues in safe contexts. This is not about forgetting the trauma. It is about teaching the brain that the trauma is over and that current circumstances are safe. The process is difficult and requires careful therapeutic support, but it can reduce symptoms by changing what the brain predicts. The brain's capacity for pattern recognition, essential for prediction, can also lead to errors. Pareidolia, seeing patterns like faces in random stimuli, reflects the brain's bias toward familiar configurations. Apophenia, perceiving meaningful connections in unrelated events, can lead to superstitious beliefs or conspiracy theories when pattern detection operates without adequate skepticism. The brain is wired to find patterns because pattern recognition has been adaptive, but this same capacity can misfire. Research on pattern recognition, conducted at institutions like the University of Vienna and the Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at Yale, has shown that people vary in their tendency to see patterns. Those higher in traits associated with psychosis proneness tend to see more patterns, even in random noise. This is not pathological unless it becomes distressing or impairing, but it demonstrates that the threshold for pattern detection is tunable and differs across individuals. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek and interpret information in ways that confirm existing beliefs, reflects the brain's preference for predictions that match its models. When a model is strongly held, prediction errors that contradict it are often dismissed or reinterpreted, rather than prompting model revision. This is efficient in stable environments where existing models are usually correct, but it can lead to persistent false beliefs when the environment changes or when the original model was wrong. Studies on confirmation bias, conducted at institutions like Stanford University and the University of Colorado, have shown that this bias operates automatically and affects even trained scientists when evaluating data relevant to their own theories. The brain's predictive nature makes it resistant to change, and overcoming this resistance requires deliberate effort, active consideration of alternative explanations, and willingness to update models in light of evidence. The brain's energy demands reflect its computational intensity. Approximately 20% of the body's energy goes to the brain, despite the brain being only about 2% of body weight. Much of this energy supports the electrical activity of neurons, maintaining ion gradients across cell membranes and powering synaptic transmission. The brain cannot store energy the way muscles can, so it requires a constant supply of glucose and oxygen. Interruption of this supply, even briefly, causes rapid loss of consciousness and can lead to permanent damage. Research on brain metabolism, conducted at institutions like the Salk Institute and the University of Cambridge, has shown that different brain regions and different cognitive tasks have varying energy demands. Intense cognitive effort, such as sustained concentration or working memory tasks, increases glucose metabolism in relevant brain regions. This increased demand is part of what makes mental effort tiring. The brain is literally consuming more fuel, and when resources run low, performance declines. The blood-brain barrier, a selective filter that controls which substances can pass from blood into brain tissue, protects the brain from toxins and pathogens, but also complicates drug delivery. Many compounds that might be therapeutic cannot cross the barrier, limiting treatment options for brain disorders. Researchers are developing methods to bypass or temporarily open the barrier, but this remains a significant challenge in neuroscience and medicine. Studies on the blood-brain barrier, conducted at institutions like the Oregon Health and Science University and the University of Geneva, have shown that the barrier is not uniformly impermeable. Certain areas, particularly those involved in detecting toxins or regulating hormones, have more permeable barriers. Understanding these variations helps explain why some brain regions are more vulnerable to certain substances and why some treatments work better than others. Glial cells, long thought to be merely supportive tissue, are now recognized as active participants in brain function. Astrocytes regulate neurotransmitter levels, provide metabolic support, and influence synaptic transmission. Microglia act as the brain's immune cells, clearing debris and responding to injury. Oligodendrocytes produce myelin, the insulating sheath that speeds electrical signals along axons. Together, glial cells outnumber neurons and play essential roles in brain health and function. Research on glia, conducted at institutions like Stanford University and the German Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases, has shown that glial dysfunction contributes to various neurological conditions. In Alzheimer's disease, microglia may contribute to inflammation that damages neurons. In multiple sclerosis, oligodendrocytes are targeted by the immune system, leading to demyelination and impaired neural communication. Understanding glial biology is opening new avenues for treatment. Neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that neurons use to communicate, shape the brain's predictive processes in fundamental ways. Dopamine signals prediction error, highlighting when outcomes differ from expectations. Serotonin modulates mood and appears to influence how the brain weighs different possible futures. Norepinephrine regulates arousal and attention. GABA and glutamate, the brain's primary inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters, balance neural activity, preventing both excessive silence and runaway excitation. Research on neurotransmitter systems, conducted at institutions like the Karolinska Institute and Columbia University, has shown that these chemical systems interact in complex ways. Medications that target one neurotransmitter often affect others indirectly. Antidepressants that increase serotonin availability can also influence dopamine and norepinephrine. Antipsychotics that block dopamine receptors can affect motor control and motivation, alongside their intended effects on psychotic symptoms. The gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication between the digestive system and the brain, reveals that the brain's function is influenced by factors far beyond the skull. The gut contains a vast network of neurons, sometimes called the enteric nervous system, and it communicates with the brain via the vagus nerve and chemical signals. Gut microbiota, the trillions of microorganisms living in the digestive tract, produce neurotransmitters and other compounds that can affect mood, cognition, and behavior. Research on the gut-brain axis, conducted at institutions like University College Cork and the University of California, Los Angeles, has shown that alterations in gut microbiota are associated with conditions including depression, anxiety, and autism spectrum disorders. While causation is not yet fully established, these findings suggest that brain function depends partly on maintaining healthy gut ecosystems. Diet, which shapes microbiota composition, may thus influence mental health in ways that were not previously recognized. The immune system also communicates with the brain, and immune activation can affect mood and cognition. Inflammation, whether from infection, injury, or chronic illness, produces cytokines that signal the brain. This triggers sickness behavior. A suite of changes, including fatigue, reduced appetite, social withdrawal, and low mood. These changes are adaptive in the short term, conserving energy for fighting illness and reducing the spread of contagion. When inflammation becomes chronic, however, sickness behavior can persist, contributing to depression and cognitive decline. Research on neuroinflammation, conducted at institutions like Emory University and the University of Glasgow, has shown that anti-inflammatory treatments can sometimes improve mood in people with depression, particularly those with elevated inflammatory markers. This has led to interest in immune-targeted therapies for psychiatric conditions, a shift from the traditional focus on neurotransmitters alone. The cerebellum, long associated primarily with motor coordination, is now known to be involved in cognition as well. It contains more neurons than the rest of the brain combined and has extensive connections with cerebral cortex. Studies have shown that cerebellar damage can impair not just movement, but also language, attention, and emotional regulation. The cerebellum appears to function as a general-purpose error correction system, refining predictions across multiple domains. Research on the cerebellum, conducted at institutions like University College London and the University of Minnesota, has shown that this structure is active during many cognitive tasks, not just motor ones. It may serve to compare predicted outcomes with actual outcomes across diverse processes, contributing to learning and adaptation broadly. This expanding understanding of cerebellar function reflects a broader theme in neuroscience. Brain regions once thought to have single, specific functions often turn out to be involved in multiple processes. Hemispheric specialization, the observation that the left and right sides of the brain have somewhat different functions, has been popularized in ways that oversimplify the reality. While it is true that language is typically lateralized to the left hemisphere and certain spatial functions to the right, the idea that people are left-brained or right-brained is not supported by evidence. Both hemispheres are active during nearly all tasks, and they communicate extensively via the corpus callosum. Research on hemispheric specialization, conducted at institutions like the University of Utah and the University of Oxford, has shown that lateralization is a matter of degree rather than absolute division. Some functions show strong lateralization, while others are distributed across both hemispheres. Moreover, if one hemisphere is damaged early in development, the other can often take over its functions, demonstrating plasticity. The two hemispheres work together, and healthy brain function depends on their integration. The study of synesthesia, where stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to automatic experiences in another, provides insight into how the brain's predictive models can be wired differently. People with grapheme color synesthesia, for instance, consistently see specific colors when viewing letters or numbers. It is automatic and involuntary, reflecting cross-activation between brain regions that are typically separate. Research on synesthesia, conducted at institutions like the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Sussex, has shown that synesthetes have enhanced connectivity between sensory regions. This may result from reduced pruning during development, leaving connections that are typically eliminated. The experience is genuine perception, demonstrating that the brain's architecture can vary across individuals in ways that produce qualitatively different experiences of the world. Sensory substitution devices, which translate one sensory modality into another, exploit the brain's plasticity and demonstrate that perception is not tied rigidly to specific sensory organs. Blind individuals using tongue-based vision systems, which translate visual input into patterns of electrical stimulation on the tongue, can learn to navigate using this information. The brain adapts to treat the tongue stimulation as a source of spatial information. Research on sensory substitution, conducted at institutions like the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Osnabrück University, has shown that with practice, users experience the information not as tongue sensations, but as external space. The brain's predictive models adapt to the new input, demonstrating that perception is more about internal processing than about the specific physical pathway by which information arrives. The brain's understanding of numbers and mathematics is another area revealing how culture and biology interact. The capacity for approximate numerical estimation appears early in development and is shared with other animals. The ability to manipulate exact numbers, however, depends on language and cultural tools like counting systems. Brain regions involved in numerical processing overlap with those involved in spatial reasoning, suggesting that mathematical thought may be grounded in spatial metaphors. Research on numerical cognition, conducted at institutions like Johns Hopkins University and the University of Tübingen, has shown that people from cultures with limited number words have difficulty with exact numerical tasks beyond small quantities, but perform well on approximate estimation. This demonstrates that higher-level mathematical abilities depend on cultural transmission and are not purely innate. The brain provides basic capacities, and culture shapes how those capacities develop. Music perception and production engage multiple brain systems, including auditory processing, motor control, emotion, and memory. Music is universal across human cultures, suggesting deep biological roots. Yet musical systems vary widely, showing that learning shapes how music is perceived and produced. The brain predicts musical structure based on learned patterns, and violations of those predictions create tension and surprise that are central to musical experience. Research on music and the brain, conducted at institutions like McGill University and the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, has shown that musical training reshapes brain structure. Musicians show enhanced auditory processing, improved motor control, and stronger connections between brain regions involved in integrating sensory and motor information. These changes demonstrate that the brain's plasticity extends to complex cultural skills. The experience of beauty, whether in art, music, nature, or mathematics, activates reward systems in the brain, particularly the medial orbitofrontal cortex. This, better sleep, a lighter day,